The lone silhouette of Gabriella Mitchell stood frozen against the dimming horizon, her fingers clutching a tattered letter that had traveled over 1,000 miles to find her. The bitter Wyoming wind of 1875 whipped her chestnut hair across her face, but she barely noticed as tears blurred the ink before her eyes. Another person gone, another promise broken. Forever is just a pretty word for fools to believe in, she whispered to the emptiness surrounding her small homestead. At 23, Gabriella had already weathered more loss than most faced in a lifetime. First her mother to consumption when she was 12, then her father to a mining accident 3 years later. Her husband Thomas, barely 2 years into their marriage, had fallen victim to a stagecoach robbery gone wrong. And now, the letter in her trembling hands informed her that her last living relative and aunt in Boston had passed away during the harsh winter. Gabriella folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She had a ranch to run, animals to feed, and no time for self-pity. Forever was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially not in the unforgiving frontier where life hung by threads as delicate as spider silk. The first snowflakes of what promised to be another brutal winter began to fall as she made her way back to the modest cabin she'd fought so hard to keep. The land had been Thomas's dream, not hers. She'd been a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania with aspirations of opening her own school someday. But love had altered her course, and now stubbornness kept her anchored to this rugged patch of earth even after that love was gone. Inside the cabin, Gabriella stoked the fire and prepared a simple meal. The food stores were lower than she'd like for this time of year. The summer drought had yielded a poor harvest, and the cattle sale hadn't brought in the money she'd hoped. If this winter was anything like the last, she might not make it through without help. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her calculations. Visitors were rare this far out, especially with darkness falling and snow beginning to accumulate. Gabriella reached for the rifle she kept by the door, another lesson the frontier had taught her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt.
"Xavier Blackwood, madam."
"My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I saw your chimney smoke." Gabriella hesitated. Trusting strangers wasn't wise, but leaving someone to freeze to death wasn't in her nature either. "I'm armed," she warned, before unlatching the door. The man standing on her porch was tall, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. His face, partially obscured by a beard that couldn't hide his strong jawline, was weathered from years under the sun. Dark eyes assessed her with equal caution. "I appreciate your candor, madam," he said, removing his hat. "I don't mean to impose, but the weather's turning fierce. I'd be grateful for shelter until morning." Gabriella studied him. His clothes were worn but clean, and despite his imposing size, something about his manner put her at ease. Besides, he was right about the weather. The wind had picked up considerably since she'd come inside. "You can stay in the barn," she decided. "There's fresh hay and it's dry. I'll bring you something to eat." Relief flickered across his face. "That's more than generous. Thank you." As she gathered a plate of beans and cornbread, Gabriella caught herself wondering about the stranger. His speech was educated, not what she'd expect from a typical drifter. His horse, which he'd led to the barn, was a fine animal despite the thrown shoe. And there was something in his eyes, a gravity, that spoke of experiences similar to her own. Later, after delivering the food and checking that he was settled, Gabriella returned to her cabin and bolted the door. Through the window, she watched the snow fall more heavily, transforming the landscape into a blank canvas. Another winter to endure alone. Little did she know, the arrival of Xavier Blackwood would change everything she thought she knew about endurance, loneliness, and the possibility of forever. Morning broke with an eerie stillness that only comes after heavy snowfall. Gabriella awoke to find nearly 2 feet of snow blanketing her property. Getting to the barn to check on her livestock and her unexpected guest would be the first challenge of many this winter day. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes, wrapping a woolen scarf around her neck before pulling on her boots. The moment she opened her door, she was greeted by a cleared path leading to the barn. Following it, she found Xavier Blackwood already at work, feeding her horses and checking on the milk cow. "Good morning," he said, straightening up when he noticed her. "Hope you don't mind. Seemed the least I could do for your hospitality." Gabriella blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that." "No trouble. I'm an early riser." He gestured toward the horses. "You've got fine animals here. That bay especially." "Thomas, my husband, he had an eye for horseflesh," she said, the words coming out before she could consider them. Xavier nodded, not pushing for more information. "I noticed your fence line on the north side is starting to sag. With this much snow, it might not hold if the wind picks up again." Gabriella sighed. The fence was just one of many repairs she'd been putting off. "I'll get to it when the weather clears." "I could take a look while I'm here," he offered. "I need to fix my horse's shoe anyway, and I noticed you have a forge in the back. Small repayment for your kindness." She studied him, suspicion rising despite his helpful demeanor. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Xavier met her gaze steadily. "Out here, folks help each other survive. That's all." Something in his straightforward answer rang true. Gabriella had been alone too long, carrying every burden herself. Perhaps it was foolish to turn away help when it was so freely offered. "All right," she conceded, "but I'll help. It's my fence, after all." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Fair enough." They spent the morning working side by side, Gabriella holding posts steady while Xavier reinforced them with fresh supports he'd fashioned from spare timber. The physical labor and focus on the task at hand kept conversation minimal, which suited Gabriella fine. She wasn't in the habit of sharing her life story with strangers, no matter how helpful they might be. By midday, they'd made significant progress despite the cold. When Gabriella invited Xavier inside for a hot meal, it seemed the natural thing to do. "You mentioned a husband," Xavier said carefully as they sat at her small table, bowls of rabbit stew steaming before them. "Is he away?" Gabriella stiffened.
He's dead.
2 years now. Xavier's expression softened with understanding rather than pity.
I'm sorry.
"It's not easy, carrying on alone." "You sound like you speak from experience," she observed. He nodded, his gaze distant. "Lost my wife and daughter to fever 5 years ago in Colorado. Been drifting since." The simple admission created an unexpected bond between them. Gabriella found herself telling him about Thomas, about the dreams they'd had for this ranch, and how she'd stubbornly clung to it even when common sense told her to sell and return east. "Why stay?" Xavier asked. "It can't be easy, a woman alone on a ranch this size." "It's not," she admitted, "but it's mine. My choice. And I've had enough of other people deciding my fate." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Independence comes at a price, but it's worth paying." "Most days," Gabriella agreed with a small smile. It was the first genuine smile she'd offered anyone in longer than she could remember. The afternoon brought more snow, making further work on the fence impossible. Instead, Xavier turned his attention to his horse's shoe, working at the small forge while Gabriella tended to indoor chores. The domesticity of it, the sound of his hammer striking metal, the smell of bread baking in her oven created an illusion of normalcy that was both comforting and unsettling. That evening, as another storm rolled in, Gabriella made a decision. "The barn's going to be too cold tonight," she said as Xavier prepared to head out after dinner. "You can sleep here by the fire. I'll keep my rifle close," she added, not wanting him to misinterpret the offer. Xavier looked surprised but grateful. "I'd appreciate that. And you have my word as a gentleman. You've nothing to fear from me." She believed him, which was perhaps the most surprising development of the day. That night, as Xavier slept on a pallet near the hearth and Gabriella lay in her bed behind a curtained alcove, she found herself more at ease than she'd been in years. Having another human presence in the house, even a stranger's, soothed an ache of loneliness she'd grown so accustomed to she hardly noticed it anymore. Morning came with the realization that the storm had intensified overnight. Peering through frost-covered windows, Gabriella could barely make out the barn through the swirling snow. "Looks like I'm imposing on your hospitality a bit longer," Xavier observed, coming to stand beside her at the window. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Gabriella surprised herself by saying, "It's no inconvenience. An extra pair of hands is welcome in weather like this." And it was true. Over the next 3 days, as the blizzard raged outside, Xavier proved himself invaluable. He repaired a leaking spot in the roof, reinforced the door that had begun to warp in the wet cold, and helped with countless small tasks that Gabriella had been putting off. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sharing stories of their lives before loss had reshaped them. Xavier, she learned, had been a rancher himself before his family's deaths. After losing them, he'd sold everything and spent years working cattle drives, mining camps, and whatever else would keep him moving. He was educated, had even attended 2 years of university back east before the call of the frontier proved too strong. "Don't you ever get tired of drifting?" Gabriella asked one evening as they sat shelling peas she'd dried from her garden. Xavier considered the question. "Sometimes. But staying in one place means putting down roots. Roots can be torn up. So can people who never plant themselves anywhere," she countered. A smile tugged at his mouth. "Fair point, Miss Mitchell." "Gabriella," she corrected him, suddenly aware that after days in each other's constant company, they were still maintaining formal address. "If we're going to be snowed in together, you might as well use my name." "Gabriella," he repeated, and something about the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her heart skip. "Then I'm Xavier to you." The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts nearly as tall as a man in some places. The morning sun turned the snow into a field of diamonds, so bright it hurt to look at directly. "I should see about getting my horse ready," Xavier said after they'd finished breakfast. Gabriella felt an unexpected pang at his words. "The trails won't be passable yet. It could be dangerous." "I've troubled you long enough," he insisted. "Where are you headed anyway?" she asked, realizing she didn't know his destination. Xavier hesitated. "Nowhere in particular. I heard Cheyenne's growing. Thought I might find work there for the winter." Gabriella made a decision then, one that seemed to come from a part of herself she thought had died with Thomas. "I could use help getting through this winter," she said carefully. "I can't pay much, but there's food and shelter. Come spring, you can move on if you still want to." Surprise registered on his face, followed by something that might have been relief. "Are you sure about that?"
You hardly know me.
"I know enough," she said simply. "And winter's only beginning. There will be more storms like this one." Xavier studied her face, as if searching for doubt or ulterior motives. Finding none, he nodded.
All right.
"Until spring, then." They settled into a rhythm as December deepened. Xavier took over the heavier outdoor work chopping wood, tending to the livestock in the barn, keeping paths cleared between the buildings. Gabriella maintained the household, cooking, mending, and preserving what remained of their stores. Together, they set traps for rabbits and other small game to supplement their dwindling supplies. As Christmas approached, Gabriella found herself watching Xavier more often than she cared to admit. The way his broad shoulders moved beneath his shirt as he worked, the gentleness in his hands when he helped deliver a calf during a particularly cold night, the quiet intelligence in his eyes when they discussed books they'd read or places they'd seen. She told herself it was natural he was the only human company she'd had in months. It didn't mean anything beyond appreciation for his help and conversation. Yet sometimes, when their hands accidentally touched passing a tool or dish, the jolt that ran through her suggested otherwise. On Christmas Eve, Xavier surprised her by coming in from his afternoon chores with a small pine tree. Thought the place could use some cheer, he said, looking almost embarrassed as he set it up in a corner. Gabriella stared at the little tree, unexpected emotion welling in her throat. Last Christmas, she'd ignored the holiday entirely, too wrapped in grief and survival to mark the occasion. "It's perfect," she managed, blinking back tears. That evening, they decorated the tree with items gathered from around the cabin, dried berries strung on thread, paper cutouts Gabriella fashioned from old catalog pages, pine cones Xavier had collected. For dinner, Gabriella splurged on their precious stores, making a feast of venison, root vegetables, and even a small cake sweetened with the last of her molasses. As they sat by the fire after dinner, bellies full and the cabin warmer than it had been in years thanks to Xavier's constant attention to the woodpile, Gabriella felt a contentment she'd nearly forgotten was possible. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the tree. For everything." Xavier looked at her, firelight dancing across his features. "I should be thanking you. You took in a stranger, gave me purpose these past weeks." "It's been nice, not being alone," she admitted. Something shifted in his expression then, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Gabriella," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Yes?" she prompted, her heart suddenly racing. Xavier shook his head slightly.
Nothing.
"Just Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Xavier," she replied, wondering what he'd been about to say, and why a part of her was disappointed he hadn't said it. That night, lying in her bed listening to Xavier's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire, Gabriella acknowledged a truth she'd been avoiding. She was developing feelings for this man who'd blown into her life, like the winter storm itself. Feelings that terrified her more than any blizzard or predator. Because Xavier would leave when spring came. That had been their agreement. And Gabriella had already learned the hard lesson that nothing, especially not love, lasted forever. January brought cold so bitter it stole breath and froze tears. The world outside shrank to the essential paths between cabin and barn, every venture requiring layers of clothing and careful planning. Inside, the cabin became their entire universe, a world of flickering firelight, steaming kettles, and increasingly comfortable silences. It was during one such silence, as Xavier mended a harness and Gabriella worked on her mending, that he finally spoke of what had happened to his family. "It wasn't just fever," he said suddenly, his hands stilling on the leather. "We couldn't afford a doctor. I was away, working a job that promised good pay. By the time I got back..." His voice trailed off. Gabriella set aside her sewing. "You couldn't have known. I should have been there," he insisted. "Emma, my wife, she was strong, but Sarah was only 4. They needed me, and I was chasing a payday 2 counties over." The self-recrimination in his voice was painfully familiar to Gabriella. "I blamed myself for Thomas too," she admitted. "He wanted to move farther north, where the land was cheaper. I insisted on staying closer to town, so I could perhaps teach someday. If we'd been farther out, he wouldn't have been on that stage when it was robbed." Xavier looked up, meeting her gaze. "That's not the same. You couldn't have predicted what would happen." "Neither could you," she countered gently. He shook his head but didn't argue further. After a moment he asked, "Do you still want to teach?" The question surprised her. No one had asked about her dreams in so long.
Sometimes I think about it.
But who would run the ranch? Why not both? Many settlements need teachers badly enough they'd work around your schedule. The suggestion was so practical, so considerate of both her needs and desires, that Gabriella felt a rush of affection for this man who listened when she spoke and remembered what mattered to her. "Perhaps," she said, allowing herself to imagine it for the first time in years. "When spring comes." The phrase hung between them, a reminder of their temporary arrangement. Xavier nodded and returned to his work, but something had changed in the atmosphere between them. A door had been opened, allowing glimpses of possible futures neither had dared consider before. As January gave way to February, those glimpses became more frequent. They began making casual references to when the snow melts and come planting time that assumed Xavier's continued presence. Neither acknowledged this shift directly, as if speaking of it might break whatever spell was slowly binding them together. Instead, they learned each other through daily interactions and nightly conversations. Gabriella discovered that Xavier had a surprising talent for sketching, capturing the landscape around them in charcoal on spare pieces of paper. Xavier learned that Gabriella could recite entire passages of Shakespeare from memory, a legacy of her teaching days. He began bringing her small treasures from his outdoor work: an unusually shaped pine cone, a piece of quartz that caught the light, a feather from a blue jay. She found herself preparing his favorite meals, setting aside the best portions for him, without conscious thought. These unspoken gestures said what neither was ready to put into words: that something was growing between them, tender as a spring shoot pushing through snow. The first major thaw came in late February, a sudden warming that turned the pristine snow to slush and revealed the muddy earth beneath. Streams that had been frozen solid for months broke free with cracking sounds that echoed through the valley like gunshots. With the thaw came the first visitors since Xavier's arrival: a neighboring rancher and his son, checking on those who'd been isolated by the harsh winter. "Mitchell Place, right?" the rancher called as he rode up, looking surprised to see Xavier chopping wood in the yard. "Don't believe we've met." Xavier set down his axe and extended a hand. "Xavier Blackwood. Been helping Miss Mitchell through the winter." The rancher, who introduced himself as James Cooper, gave Xavier an appraising look before shaking his hand. "Mighty neighborly of you." The widow Mitchells had a rough go of it these past years. Gabriella emerged from the cabin then, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Cooper, good to see you. How did your family fare through the storms?" As the men talked, Cooper's teenage son stared openly at Xavier, clearly curious about his presence. When Gabriella invited them in for coffee, the boy finally blurted out, "Are you courting the widow, mister?" "Benjamin," his father admonished. Xavier and Gabriella exchanged a startled glance, neither knowing how to answer. "Mr. Blackwood is a friend who's been kind enough to help me maintain the ranch," Gabriella said carefully. The explanation seemed to satisfy Cooper, but as they shared coffee and news of the surrounding homesteads, Gabriella was acutely aware of how their situation might appear to others. A single woman and man living under the same roof, however innocent the arrangement, was bound to raise eyebrows. After the Coopers departed with promises to spread word that the Mitchell ranch had weathered the winter well, Xavier brought up what they'd both been thinking. "People will talk," he said simply. Gabriella nodded. "They always do. Would that bother you?" His question held more weight than the words themselves suggested. She considered this. Once, she would have cared deeply about her reputation. But life on the frontier had taught her to value substance over appearance. "I'm more concerned with the truth than with gossip," she said finally. "And what is the truth, Gabriella?" Xavier asked, his voice low. The question hung between them, demanding an honesty she wasn't sure she was brave enough to offer. What was the truth? That she'd grown to depend on his presence? That the thought of him leaving when spring truly arrived filled her with dread? That somewhere between Christmas and now, she'd begun to imagine a future that included him? "The truth is you've been a godsend this winter," she said, taking the safer path. "Beyond that, I don't know." Disappointment flickered in his eyes, but he nodded. "Fair enough." That night, for the first time since his arrival, a tension lingered in the cabin. Xavier retired to his pallet earlier than usual, and Gabriella lay awake behind her curtain, regretting her cowardice, but unable to find the words to express feelings she'd sworn never to allow herself to feel again. March arrived with warming days and freezing nights, the classic pattern of late winter in Wyoming territory. The snow receded further, revealing the damage winter had wrought on fences, outbuildings, and the land itself. Together, Gabriella and Xavier assessed what needed repair before spring planting could begin. The irrigation ditch will need clearing before the spring runoff, Xavier noted as they walked the property one afternoon. And that section of fence by the east pasture won't last another season. Gabriella nodded, making mental calculations about supplies they'd need. Only after several minutes did she realize she was thinking in terms of we rather than I, as if Xavier's presence through the coming seasons was a given. Xavier, she began hesitantly. Our agreement was until spring. He stopped walking, turning to face her. The sun highlighted the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the new lines that had formed at their corners from squinting against winter's glare. It was, he acknowledged. Spring's nearly here. A muscle worked in his jaw. Are you asking me to leave, Gabriella? No, she said quickly, then more deliberately. No, I'm asking what you want. Xavier took a step closer, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. I think you know what I want. The question is, what do you want? Gabriella's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment to be brave, to risk speaking the truth they'd been dancing around for weeks. I want, she began, but was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching horses. They both turned to see a group of riders coming up the trail, 5 men, moving with purpose. Xavier tensed beside her. Get to the house, he said quietly.
Now.
Something in his tone made her obey without question. As she hurried toward the cabin, she glanced back to see Xavier striding to meet the approaching riders, his hand resting casually near the pistol he wore at his hip. From the porch, rifle in hand, Gabriella watched as Xavier exchanged words with the men. Though she couldn't hear what was said, the body language was clear this wasn't a friendly visit. After several tense minutes, the riders turned and headed back the way they'd come, with frequent glances over their shoulders. Xavier waited until they were out of sight before returning to the cabin, his expression grim. What was that about? Gabriella demanded, as soon as he was close. Trouble, he said simply, stepping onto the porch. Let's get inside. Once the door was secured behind them, Xavier explained. The men were working for a cattle company that had been buying up small ranches in the area willingly or otherwise. They'd heard the Mitchell place might be vulnerable after the harsh winter and had come to make an offer. An offer you encouraged them to take elsewhere, Gabriella guessed. Xavier's mouth set in a hard line. They weren't interested in making a fair offer. Men like that see a woman alone and think easy pickings. I'm not alone, she said without thinking. His expression softened slightly. No, you're not. But they'll be back, Gabriella. That kind doesn't give up easily. The implications settled over her like a shadow. These past months of peace had been an illusion. The world beyond their snowbound haven was still harsh, still predatory. What do we do? She asked. Xavier's use of we didn't escape her notice. For now, we stay alert. I'll ride to town tomorrow, see what I can learn about this company and who's behind it. Gabriella nodded, grateful for his steady presence, yet hating that once again, external forces were shaping her choices. They spent the remainder of the day in heightened vigilance, checking and cleaning weapons, securing doors and windows before nightfall. That night, as they sat by the fire after a quiet dinner, Xavier finally returned to their interrupted conversation. You were about to tell me what you want, he reminded her softly. Gabriella looked into the flames, gathering her courage. The day's events had clarified things for her in a way months of quiet contemplation hadn't. I want you to stay, she said simply, meeting his gaze. Not just until spring. Not just because of those men. I want you to stay because... She faltered, then forced herself to continue. Because when you're here, this place feels like home again. Xavier moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. I've been waiting to hear those words since Christmas, he admitted. I've wanted to stay, to ask for more than our arrangement, but I was afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of your situation. And I was afraid to ask you to stay when you've spent years not putting down roots, she confessed. He squeezed her hands gently. Maybe I've been running long enough. Maybe what I've been looking for is right here. The tenderness in his voice melted the last of Gabriella's resistance. When Xavier leaned forward, his question clear in his eyes, she answered by meeting him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and answer all at once. When they parted, Gabriella saw in Xavier's eyes the same wonder she felt. A beginning, unexpected and precious. I should still go to town tomorrow, he said, not moving away. Find out what we're dealing with. We'll go together, she decided. This is my ranch. I should face whatever threat comes to it. Xavier smiled, pride evident in his expression. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Gabriella Mitchell. She returned his smile, feeling stronger than she had in years. And you, Xavier Blackwood, are the first man since Thomas who makes me believe that perhaps some things can last. The town of Clearwater wasn't much to look at, a single dusty street lined with essential businesses that served the surrounding ranches and farms. The general store, saloon, small bank, and telegraph office made up the commercial district, with a church, schoolhouse, and scattered residences completing the settlement. Gabriella and Xavier rode in just before noon, the spring mud making the journey slower than usual. They decided to split up. Xavier would visit the saloon where men talked freely, while Gabriella would speak with Mrs. Henderson at the general store, who knew everyone's business for 20 miles in any direction. Meet back here in an hour, Xavier suggested as they tied their horses at the hitching post. Gabriella nodded, adjusting her bonnet. Be careful. If these men are as troublesome as we suspect, they may have friends in town. Xavier touched her arm briefly, the only public display of affection he'd allow himself in such a setting. You too. Inside the general store, Gabriella was greeted warmly by Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman in her 50s whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Gabriella Mitchell. Survived the winter, I see. We were beginning to wonder, with no sign of you these past months. The snow made travel impossible, Gabriella explained, selecting a few necessary items: coffee, sugar, ammunition, and placing them on the counter. Mrs. Henderson nodded sympathetically. Worst winter in 20 years, everyone says. You managing that place all alone still. Here was the opening Gabriella needed. Actually, I've had help this winter. A man named Xavier Blackwood was caught in the first blizzard and stayed on to help with the ranch. Interest sparked in the older woman's eyes. Blackwood? Don't believe I know him. He's been traveling for some years. Before that, he had a ranch in Colorado, Gabriella said, then carefully added, he mentioned that some cattle company has been buying up small ranches around here.
Would you know anything about that?
Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened. That would be Western Frontier Holdings. Showed up last fall with deep pockets and fancy lawyers. Bought the old Peterson place first, then the Wilsons after that terrible accident.
Accident?
Gabriella prompted. The storekeeper leaned forward, lowering her voice. Fire in their barn. Lost most of their stock. Convenient timing for Western Frontier to make an offer they couldn't refuse. She shook her head. For more places since then. Always after some misfortune. A chill ran down Gabriella's spine. Do you know who's behind this company? Some say it's backed by Eastern money, but the man giving orders around here is Jasper Holt. Used to ride with a rough crowd during the war. Now he wears fine suits and calls himself a businessman. Mrs. Henderson's disapproving sniff made her opinion of this transformation clear. Gabriella paid for her purchases, her mind racing with this new information. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, she nearly collided with a well-dressed man emerging from the bank. Pardon me, madam, he said, tipping his hat. He was perhaps 40, with cold blue eyes that assessed her with uncomfortable thoroughness. No harm done, Gabriella replied, moving to step around him. You look familiar, he said, blocking her path slightly. Have we met? I don't believe so. A smile that didn't reach his eyes spread across his face. You must be Mrs. Mitchell. From the ranch north of town. Gabriella tensed. Miss Mitchell, yes. And you are? Jasper Holt, he said, extending a hand she reluctantly shook. I believe my associates called on you yesterday. They did, she confirmed, keeping her tone neutral. I wasn't interested in their proposal. Holt's smile tightened. Perhaps we should discuss it more thoroughly. Business is always better conducted face-to-face, don't you think? I'd be happy to explain the benefits of our offer over dinner. The invitation, delivered with an expectation of acceptance, made Gabriella's skin crawl. That won't be necessary, Mr. Holt. My decision isn't going to change. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. You should reconsider, Miss Mitchell. Wyoming can be a dangerous place for a woman alone. Properties without proper protection often suffer unfortunate incidents. The threat, thinly veiled as concern, hung in the air between them. Is there a problem here? Xavier's deep voice came from behind her. Gabriella felt a rush of relief as Xavier moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Holt's eyes narrowed as he took in Xavier's protective stance. Not at all. Just making the acquaintance of Miss Mitchell here. And you are?
Xavier Blackwood.
I help Miss Mitchell run her ranch. The two men sized each other up, tension crackling between them. I see, Holt said finally. Well, my offer remains open, Miss Mitchell. For now. With a final tip of his hat, he continued down the boardwalk. That's him, Gabriella said quietly once Holt was out of earshot. Jasper Holt, the one behind the cattle company buying up ranches.
Xavier nudda grimly.
I heard the same in the saloon, along with rumors that ranches that refuse to sell tend to have bad luck afterward. They collected their horses and headed out of town, both lost in thought about the implied threat. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Xavier broke the silence. We should consider what this means, Gabriella. Holt isn't going to back down easily. Men like him never do. I won't be bullied off my land, she said firmly. I'm not suggesting you should be, Xavier assured her. But we need to be prepared. Increase our vigilance. Maybe bring in help if we can find trustworthy hands. Gabriella nodded, appreciating that he didn't try to convince her to sell. The Coopers might lend us their older sons for a while. And perhaps the Andersons from the South Valley. Good thinking. We'll ride out tomorrow, make arrangements. Xavier paused, then added, This changes things, Gabriella. What's between us? It might need to wait. She looked at him sharply. Why? Because I don't want anyone thinking I have designs on your property. That I'm using you to gain control of your land. The concern touched her. He was protecting her reputation as well as ensuring no one could question her ownership of the ranch. But after months of slowly moving toward each other, the idea of stepping back felt wrong. I appreciate the thought, she said carefully, but I won't let Holt or anyone else dictate how we live our lives. If they want to gossip, let them. Xavier studied her for a long moment, then smiled. Have I mentioned how remarkable you are, Gabriella Mitchell? The warmth in his voice chased away the chill that Holt's threats had left. Not nearly often enough, she teased. They rode the rest of the way home planning their defenses, both practical and strategic. By the time they reached the ranch, they had outlined a schedule for guard rotations, identified vulnerable points on the property, and decided which neighbors to approach first for assistance. That night, as they sat close together on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Gabriella felt a curious blend of apprehension and peace. The threat looming over them was real, but facing it with Xavier at her side made it seem manageable in a way it wouldn't have been before. I've been thinking, Xavier said, his voice thoughtful, about what you said, not letting others dictate how we live our lives. Gabriella turned to look at him, curious about his tone. I've spent 5 years letting grief and guilt determine my path, he continued, running from place to place, never allowing myself to build anything permanent. But being here with you these past months, It's reminded me what it feels like to have purpose, to belong somewhere. He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. I don't want to run anymore, Gabriella. Whatever comes with Holt, whatever challenges we face, I want to face them with you. Not just as your hired help or even as your friend. If you'll have me. The depth of emotion in his eyes took her breath away. This wasn't a hasty declaration born of their present danger, but a carefully considered choice, one he'd been moving toward since that first snowfall had brought him to her door. Are you asking what I think you're asking? She whispered. Xavier's smile was tender. I'm not rushing you. I know it's soon, and with everything happening. But I want you to know where I stand. That I'm here for as long as you want me, in whatever capacity you'll accept me. Gabriella squeezed his hand, her heart full. I stopped believing in forever after Thomas died. It seemed like a cruel illusion, something people pretend exists to make life's uncertainties bearable. And now, he prompted gently. Now I think perhaps forever isn't about guarantees. It's about choosing someone every day for as many days as you're given. She met his gaze steadily. I choose you, Xavier. Today and tomorrow and for whatever days come after that. He drew her close, his kiss a promise more binding than any words could be. When they parted, the fading light caught the moisture in his eyes. Forever it is, then, he murmured against her hair. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to the Mitchell ranch. True to their word, the Cooper and Anderson families sent sons to help patrol the property. Xavier supervised the construction of additional windbreaks for the cattle and reinforcement of fences and outbuildings. Gabriella organized supplies, ensuring they could withstand a potential siege if Holt tried to cut them off from town. Through it all, their relationship deepened. The shared purpose and common enemy only strengthened the bond that had formed during their isolated winter. Xavier moved from his pallet by the fire to the small second bedroom that had once been intended for the children. Thomas and Gabriella had hoped to have a change that raised eyebrows among their neighbors, but was accepted without comment given the circumstances. April brought the first real stirrings of spring, green shoots pushing through the earth, buds swelling on tree branches, and the return of birds from their winter migrations. With the improved weather came increased vigilance. Xavier insisted on someone watching the approach to the ranch at all times, a precaution that seemed excessive until the evening. Jim Cooper's eldest son spotted riders approaching after sunset. 3 men, coming fast along the creek bed, he reported, slightly out of breath from running to the main house. Xavier immediately sent word to the other hands, positioning them strategically around the property while Gabriella extinguished most of the lamps in the cabin, leaving just enough light to create silhouettes through the windows. Stay away from the windows, Xavier instructed her, checking his rifle for the 3rd time. If shooting starts, get down on the floor behind the stove. Gabriella nodded, her own shotgun loaded and ready. Be careful, she said as he prepared to take up position on the porch. He paused, touching her cheek briefly. Always. The weight was excruciating. Gabriella moved silently through the cabin, checking that all entrances were secured, straining to hear any sound of approach above the pounding of her own heart. When the first shot rang out, she nearly jumped out of her skin. It came from the direction of the barn, followed by a shout and more gunfire. Unable to bear not knowing what was happening, Gabriella crept to a window, staying to the side as Xavier had taught her. In the moonlight, she could make out shadowy figures moving between buildings. A flash of gunfire illuminated a scene of chaos, one man down near the corral, others exchanging fire from behind whatever cover they could find. Then she saw Xavier, moving with purpose toward the barn where the intruders seemed to be focusing their efforts. Just as he reached the door, a figure emerged from around the corner, pistol raised. Xavier, behind you! Gabriella screamed, forgetting all caution. He spun just in time, firing twice. The man crumpled to the ground. The exchange seemed to turn the tide. Within minutes, the remaining intruders were retreating, dragging their wounded with them. By the time Xavier and the hands regrouped near the house, the sound of galloping horses confirmed the attackers were gone. "Anyone hurt?" Xavier called out, scanning the men gathered in the yard. Young Cooper had a graze on his arm but insisted it was nothing serious. The others were shaken but unharmed. "They were trying to fire the barn," Anderson's middle son reported. "Had coal oil and matches." Xavier's expression hardened, just like the Peterson place. Gabriella's blood ran cold as she remembered Mrs. Henderson's words about convenient accidents. She hurried down from the porch to join the men, relief washing over her when she confirmed with her own eyes that Xavier was truly unharmed. "We need to report this to the sheriff," she insisted. Xavier nodded grimly. "First thing tomorrow. Tonight, we double the watch. They might come back with reinforcements." The night passed without further incident, but none of them slept well. At first light, Xavier and Gabriella rode to town, leaving the Cooper and Anderson boys to guard the ranch. Sheriff Davis listened to their account with a deepening frown. "You're certain it was Holt's men?" "One of them was the same fellow who came with Holt's offer last month," Xavier confirmed. "Tall man with a scar along his jaw." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his forehead. "That would be Ray Wilkins. Works for Holt right enough." He looked genuinely troubled. "Problem is, without proof they were acting on Holt's orders." "They tried to burn our barn," Gabriella said incredulously. "Just like they did to the Petersons and Wilsons before forcing them to sell." "I understand your frustration, Miss Mitchell, but Holt's careful. Never does his own dirty work. Always has an alibi." The sheriff leaned forward. "I'll question Wilkins if we can find him, maybe put some pressure on Holt to back off. But the truth is, my jurisdiction only goes so far against a man with money and connections." Xavier's hand found Gabriella's under the desk, squeezing gently in silent support. "So we're on our own," she concluded. Sheriff Davis had the grace to look ashamed. "I didn't say that. I'll do what I can. Just be prepared for Holt to deny everything and for nothing much to come of it officially." As they left the sheriff's office, Gabriella felt a mixture of anger and resignation. The law, it seemed, had its limits on the frontier. "Now what?" she asked as they untied their horses. Xavier's expression was determined. "Now we change tactics. If Holt won't play by the rules, neither will we." Over the next week, Xavier put his plan into action. Rather than merely defending the ranch, they began gathering information on Holt's operation. Young Jim Cooper was sent to apply for work with Western Frontier Holdings, providing insider access to their movements. Xavier reconnected with old acquaintances from his cattle driving days, men who knew the territory and weren't afraid to bend rules when necessary. Bit by bit, they pieced together the extent of Holt's operation and its vulnerabilities. His company had overextended, promising Eastern investors returns they couldn't deliver without acquiring more land at below-market prices. If enough ranchers held out, the entire scheme might collapse. Armed with this knowledge, Xavier and Gabriella rode from ranch to ranch, speaking with families who had thus far resisted Holt's offers. Together, they formed an alliance, pooling resources for defense and agreeing to hold firm against any buyout attempts. The strategy worked better than they dared hope. By early May, word reached them that Holt's Eastern backers were growing impatient with his lack of progress. The company's deadline for acquiring additional properties was approaching, and Holt was becoming desperate. "He'll make one more push," Xavier predicted as they discussed the latest news over dinner. "Something big to try to break our coalition." Gabriella nodded, having come to the same conclusion. "The question is, what form will it take? And are we ready?" They had their answer 3 days later, when Jim Cooper returned from town with troubling news. "Holt's bringing in professional gunmen," he reported. "Overheard him arranging it at the saloon. Said they'd make an example of someone to convince the others." Xavier and Gabriella exchanged a look of understanding. The Mitchell Ranch, as the center of resistance, would be the likely target. That night, as they prepared for bed, Xavier took Gabriella's hands in his. "I want you to consider leaving," he said quietly. "Just until this is resolved. Your cousin in Denver would take you in." Gabriella shook her head firmly. "I'm not running, Xavier. This is my home or home. I won't be driven from it." He sighed, having expected this response but needing to make the offer anyway. "Then we face it together." "But Gabriella." He hesitated, then continued, "If anything happens to me, don't," she interrupted, pressing her fingers to his lips. "We're not saying goodbyes." Xavier caught her hand, kissing her palm. "Not goodbyes. But I need you to know. These months with you have been the happiest of my life. Whatever comes next, I have no regrets." Tears welled in Gabriella's eyes. "Nor do I. You brought life back to this place, Xavier. To me." He drew her into his arms, holding her as if he could shield her from what was coming through the force of his embrace alone. That night, their lovemaking was tender, yet desperate, each touch a promise and a prayer for more time. The next morning, they put the final pieces of their plan in place. Messages were sent to their allies, positions assigned, supplies distributed. By midday, the Mitchell Ranch was as prepared as it could be for whatever Holt might throw at them. They didn't have long to wait. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jim Cooper spotted a large group of riders approaching from the south, at least 15 men, moving with obvious purpose. "This is it," Xavier said, checking his weapons one final time. "Remember the plan. No one engages unless absolutely necessary. Our goal is to hold them off until the sheriff arrives with the U.S. Marshal." Gabriella nodded, her heart racing but her hands steady. They had managed to convince the sheriff to telegraph for federal assistance by providing evidence of Holt's fraudulent land deals transactions that crossed territorial lines and thus fell under federal jurisdiction. The marshal was due in Clearwater today, assuming all had gone according to schedule. "I love you," she said simply, looking up at the man who had changed her understanding of what was possible. Xavier's smile was tender despite the tension of the moment. "And I love you, more than I have words for." They took their positions, Xavier with several of their allies near the main approach, Gabriella and 2 others at the house, where they could provide covering fire if needed. The remaining defenders were stationed at strategic points around the property, ready to converge if any section came under heavy attack. Holt's men approached without any attempt at stealth, clearly confident in their superior numbers. They halted just beyond rifle range, and a familiar figure rode forward slightly. "Mitchell," Holt called out. "Final chance to sell peacefully. Name your price." Xavier stepped into view, rifle held casually but ready. "The ranch isn't for sale, Holt. Not today, not ever." Even at a distance, they could see Holt's face darken with anger. "You're making a mistake, Blackwood. I know about your past, the debts, the trouble in Colorado. You really think the widow Mitchell would still want you if she knew everything?" Gabriella felt a momentary flash of uncertainty. What wasn't Xavier telling her? But pushed it aside. Whatever Holt was implying, it was surely twisted to serve his purposes. "Your threats don't work on us, Holt," Xavier replied evenly. "And neither do your lies. Ride away while you still can." Holt laughed, the sound carrying across the distance between them. Brave words from a man about to lose everything. Again. He turned to his men. "Burn them out. Anyone who resists, shoot them." The attackers spread out, clearly intending to approach from multiple directions. Xavier and his men held their ground, waiting for the first hostile move. It came in the form of a flaming arrow arcing toward the hay barn. One of the Anderson boys shot it down mid-flight, and the battle was joined. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the defenders using their knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. Gabriella found herself firing with cool precision whenever an attacker came into view, then ducking back behind cover. The fighting continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes. Holt's men were experienced, but hadn't expected such organized resistance. 3 of their number were down, others pinned behind inadequate cover. Then Gabriella spotted Holt himself circling wide, apparently trying to reach the house from the rear. Without hesitation, she moved to intercept him, working her way through the vegetable garden to come up behind the storage shed where he'd taken position. "Drop the gun, Holt," she commanded, her shotgun leveled at his back. He froze, then slowly turned, keeping his pistol pointed at the ground. "Mrs. Mitchell. Or is it still Miss? Hard to keep track of the arrangements you and Blackwood have made." "The only arrangement that matters is the one where you leave our land," she replied steadily. "It's over. The marshal knows about your operation. Even if you win today, you lose everything." Uncertainty flickered across Holt's face, but was quickly replaced by calculation. "Maybe. Or maybe I take you with me, use you to ensure my safe passage." "I wouldn't advise that," Xavier's voice came from behind her. He stepped into view, his rifle trained on Holt. "Drop the gun.
Now."
For a tense moment, Gabriella thought Holt might try something desperate. Then the sound of many horses approaching drew their attention. Over the ridge came Sheriff Davis, accompanied by a man wearing the distinctive badge of a U.S. Marshal and at least a dozen deputies. Holt's shoulders sagged in defeat. He let his pistol fall to the ground. The arrival of the law enforcement contingent quickly ended the remaining resistance. Holt and his surviving men were disarmed and placed under arrest for attempted murder, arson, fraud, and a host of other charges the marshal listed with evident satisfaction. As the prisoners were led away, Gabriella turned to Xavier, suddenly remembering Holt's accusation. "What did he mean about your past? About debts in Colorado?" Xavier sighed, looking weary but relieved. "After Emma and Sarah died, I was in a bad place. Drank too much, gambled, got into debt. Made some poor choices trying to clear those debts. Nothing violent," he added quickly, "but nothing I'm proud of either." Gabriella studied his face, seeing the remorse and honesty there. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I meant to," he said quietly. "But at first it didn't seem relevant, and then I was afraid of losing your good opinion, of giving you reason to doubt me." She touched his cheek gently. "We all have parts of our past we're not proud of, Xavier. What matters is who you are now, who we are together." Relief washed over his features. "And who are we, Gabriella Mitchell?" She smiled, the answer simple and clear despite all they'd just endured. "We're 2 people who found each other against all odds, who proved that even in the harshest conditions, love can not only survive but flourish." Xavier drew her close, uncaring of the audience of neighbors and lawmen still milling about. "In that case, there's something I've been wanting to ask you properly." To Gabriella's surprise, he knelt before her in the dirt of their battleground, taking her hands in his. "Gabriella Mitchell, I came to your door a stranger seeking shelter from a storm. You gave me not just a roof over my head, but a home in every sense of the word. You taught me that it's never too late to start again, to build something lasting." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Will you marry me? Make this partnership official in the eyes of God and everyone else?" Tears blurred Gabriella's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then louder for all to hear. "Yes, Xavier Blackwood. I will marry you." The cheers of their friends and neighbors surrounded them as Xavier rose to seal their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Clearwater. The entire community turned out to witness the union of the woman who'd held onto her ranch against all odds and the drifter who'd found his home in her heart. Mrs. Henderson cried openly during the ceremony, while Sheriff Davis looked uncomfortably emotional in his Sunday best. "I, Xavier, take you, Gabriella, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Xavier's strong voice carried through the church, unwavering and sure. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. When it was her turn, Gabriella looked up into the eyes of the man who had changed everything for her. I, Gabriella, take you, Xavier, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she said, her heart so full it felt it might burst. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. As they exchanged rings, simple bands that Xavier had ridden all the way to Cheyenne to purchase, Gabriella reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that snowy night, when a stranger knocked on her door, to this spring day filled with promise, she had traveled from despair to hope, from loneliness to love. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the pastor declared. You may kiss your bride. Xavier's kiss was gentle yet profound, a promise kept and renewed. The celebration afterward at the Mitchell, now Blackwood Mitchell Ranch, lasted well into the evening. Neighbors brought food and drink, musicians played, and children danced around the bonfire as the stars appeared in the clear spring sky. Happy? Xavier asked as they finally found a moment alone, standing on the porch of what was now truly their home. Gabriella leaned against him, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate. More than I ever thought possible. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her head. You know, when I first came here, I thought I was just seeking shelter from a storm. I had no idea I was actually finding everything I'd been looking for all those years on the road. And I thought I was just being charitable to a stranger, she replied with a soft laugh. Instead, I found the courage to believe in forever again. Forever, Xavier repeated, turning her to face him. That's what I promise you, Gabriella Blackwood. Not that life will always be easy, we know better than that. But that whatever comes, whatever storms we face them together. Together, she agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Epilogue. 5 years later, the winter of 1880 was nearly as harsh as the one that had brought Xavier to Gabriella's door 5 years earlier. Snow piled high around the expanded Blackwood Mitchell Ranch house, and the wind howled through the valley with vengeful force. Inside, however, all was warmth and light. The main room, enlarged the previous summer, glowed with lamplight and the dancing flames in the stone fireplace Xavier had built with his own hands. Pine boughs decorated the mantel, filling the air with their fresh scent, while a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with ornaments both old and new. Gabriella moved between the kitchen and dining area, putting final touches on the holiday meal while keeping an eye on 3-year-old Thomas, who was arranging wooden animals in complex formations on the rug. From the bedroom came Xavier's deep voice and the delighted giggles of their daughter Emma, not yet a year old and fascinated by her father's storytelling. The past 5 years had transformed not just their lives but the ranch itself. With Holt's operation dismantled and legitimate investors stepping in, the region had stabilized. The Blackwood Mitchell Ranch had prospered, expanding its herd and acreage. Xavier's knowledge of cattle breeding had proven invaluable, while Gabriella's dream of teaching had been realized through the small school she ran 3 days a week in a converted outbuilding, serving the children of neighboring ranches as well as their own son. The sound of Xavier's boots in the hallway made her look up from the pie she was sliding into the oven. He appeared with Emma in his arms, the baby's dark curls so like her father's sticking up endearingly. Someone is very interested in her Christmas dinner, Xavier announced, planting a kiss on his daughter's chubby cheek. Gabriella smiled at the sight of them. She'll have to be patient just a little longer. The Coopers and Andersons should be here soon. Their holiday tradition of hosting neighbors had begun their first Christmas as a married couple and grown each year. Tonight, with the storm temporarily abated, they expected 3 families to brave the snow for fellowship and celebration. Xavier set Emma in her high chair and came to wrap his arms around Gabriella from behind. Have I told you today how much I love you? He murmured against her ear. She leaned back into his embrace, savoring the solid warmth of him. Only twice. You're falling behind schedule. His chuckle rumbled through her. Well then, Mrs. Blackwood, let me be absolutely clear. I love you more today than yesterday, but not as much as I will tomorrow. Such poetry from a rancher, she teased, turning to face him. You inspire me, he said simply, and the sincerity in his eyes still had the power to take her breath away. A clamor of voices and stamping of boots on the porch announced their guest's arrival. The quiet moment between them ended, but the connection remained as they moved together to welcome friends into their home. Hours later, with the meal finished, gifts exchanged, and guests departed back to their own homes through the freshly fallen snow, Gabriella stood at the window watching the moonlight transform the landscape into a silver wonderland. Thomas and Emma were asleep, the house was peaceful, and Xavier was banking the fire for the night. What are you thinking about so seriously? He asked, coming to stand beside her. Gabriella smiled, leaning against his solid presence. I was remembering something I said to you that first winter, about how I couldn't believe in forever. Xavier slipped an arm around her waist. I remember. You were quite convinced on the subject. I was wrong, she said simply. You proved me wrong, Xavier. Not with grand gestures or impossible promises, but with every day we've shared, with every challenge we've faced together. He turned her to face him, his expression serious, yet tender. Do you know when I knew I would love you forever? It wasn't when you took me in that snowy night, though I was grateful. It wasn't even during those long winter months when we grew close. When was it? She asked, curious. It was when Holt threatened everything we'd built, and you stood your ground. When you refused to run, refused to let fear dictate your choices. He touched her cheek gently. Your courage, your determination to create a life on your own terms, that's what made me fall in love with you, Gabriella. And it's what reminds me every day how fortunate I am to share that life. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of happiness, of gratitude for the unexpected path that had led her here to this man, these children, this life full of challenges and joys. I love you, Xavier Blackwood, she whispered. Today, tomorrow, and for all the winters to come. As snow continued to fall outside their window, they stood together in the warm circle of lamplight, two people who had found in each other the strength to believe in possibilities, in new beginnings, and in a love that could indeed survive the harshest winters and flourish in the springs that inevitably followed.